Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take your sources and pull out the most important insights.
Hello.
Today, we're digging into a specific piece of a really foundational document for anyone in the patent world, the Manual of Patent Examining Procedure, the MPEP.
Right. And as you know, this is part of our larger series where we're breaking down the MPEP section by section.
Trying to make it a bit more digestible, one piece at a time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So today, we're landing in Chapter 2100, which is all about patentability.
And specifically,
Section 2181.
2181. That's the one on identifying and interpreting a 35 U.S.C. 112, or the Pre-AIA version, 6-paragraph limitation. Quite a title.
It is, but don't let the title intimidate you.
Yeah.
This section is really fundamental.
Yeah, it seems to tackle how examiners and, well, courts, too, eventually figure out if a claim has these things called means plus function or step plus function limitations.
That's the core of it. And critically, what it actually means for the scope of the patent claim when they find one.
It sounds like a tricky area, honestly.
It can be. Normally, patent claims have to define an invention by its structure, its components, maybe specific actions,
Right.
what it is.
Right.
But 112F is kind of an exception. It lets you claim something, in part, by what it does its function.
If you follow the rules.
Exactly. There are specific requirements. And Section 2181 basically gives the examiner and us the playbook for figuring out when this special rule applies.
Okay, so let's unpack that playbook. Your sources mention a clear 3-part test in 2181 for spotting these 112 F limitations. What's step 1?
Okay, first step is purely about the words used. Does the claim use the magic word means, typically for an apparatus, or step for a method?
Means 4 or step 4?
Usually yes. Or, and this is important, does it use a sort of generic placeholder instead? Something like module, device, unit, component, mechanism. Words that don't inherently scream structure.
So you're looking for means, step, or these kind of vague nouns.
That's the initial flag, yes.
Yeah.
But just seeing the word isn't enough.
Hey.
That leads to the second part of the test.
Which is
that term, whether it's means, step, or that generic placeholder like module, is it tied to functional language? Does the claim describe the term by what it does, what function it performs?
okay. So not just a circuit, but maybe a module for processing data.
Yeah.
Or a means for attaching A to B.
Precisely. Configured to for performing, things like that. So you've got the term and you've got its job description, essentially.
Got it. Term plus function. What's the third leg of this stool?
Now, this is often the crucial one, the part that sometimes trips people up. The third question is, does the claim limitation lack sufficient structure, material, or specific acts within the claim itself to actually perform that recited function?
Whoa, okay. So it's not enough to just use a generic word and a function. The claim also has to be silent, or nearly silent, on the how, on the actual, nuts and bolts or the specific actions involved.
That's exactly it. The lack of structure in the claim is key. So if you use means, you link it to a function, and the claim text itself doesn't give enough structural detail about how that function is achieved.
Then all 3 parts are met.
Bingo. All 3 parts are met. And if that happens, the rule says the limitation must be interpreted under 35 U.S.C. 112.
Okay, and that interpretation, what does it do to the claim? How is it read differently?
It fundamentally changes how you determine its scope. Instead of just looking at the claim words, the scope of that limitation is restricted. It covers only the corresponding structure, material, or acts described in the patent specification, the written description part, that perform that function, plus their equivalents.
I see. So the claim language pulls the trigger, but then you have to run back to the specification to find out what the actual boundaries are.
You got it. The specification becomes the dictionary, defining what that functional term actually covers.
Let's make this concrete. Case law examples usually help.
Definitely. The MPEP itself relies heavily on case law here. Your sources point to Williamson v. Citrix Online.
Right, the Distributed Learning Control Module 1.
That's the one. The court looked at that phrase, module. Okay, that's a generic placeholder, potentially triggering the first part. It was tied to a function controlling distributed learning. Second part met. Then the court asked, does the claim itself describe the structure of this module?
And it didn't.
Not sufficiently, no. So, boom, all 3 parts met. It was treated as a 112F limitation. And its scope wasn't just any module that could control learning. It was limited to the specific structure the inventors actually described in their specification for doing that job.
Okay, that makes sense. What about the other side? Examples of terms that don't trigger on 12F? Terms that are considered structural enough.
Yeah, the MPEP gives examples cited in cases like detent mechanism or circuit.
Why are those different? They still perform functions, right? A circuit processes signals.
They do perform functions, but the key is that those terms like circuit or detent mechanism are understood by someone skilled in that technical field to connote a recognized class of structures. The word itself carries enough structural meaning.
So the term isn't just a generic placeholder, it actually implies a certain type of physical arrangement.
Exactly. So even if it's linked to a function, because the term itself provides sufficient structural identity in the claim, it generally avoids the 112F treatment.
This really highlights that the focus is squarely on the claim language, isn't it? Section 2181 seems pretty adamant about that.
Absolutely. It hammers this point home. It's not about guessing the applicant's secret intent or relying only on something they said elsewhere, like a disclaimer. The examiner has to look at the claim language itself and ask how someone skilled in the art would understand it.
So this means you could avoid using the word means entirely, but if you use, say, component for filtering and don't describe the filter structure in the claim, you could still end up under 112F.
That's exactly right. The substance over form principle applies. Using a generic term plus function without claiming structure gets you there, regardless of whether means is present.
And conversely, if you do use means, like means for filtering comprising a mesh screen.
Good counterexample. If you use means, but also include clear, specific structural language right there in the claim that performs the function, like your mesh screen example, then that structure might be enough to take it out of 112, even with the word means.
Wow, okay. So the claim's own detail can override the means presumption.
It can. It all comes back to whether the claim, read as a whole, provides that structure.
It sounds like the message is crystal clear. Precision in drafting during prosecution is absolutely vital.
Couldn't say it better. And the burden is on the applicant to get it right. Cases like Inri Morris and Inri Zletz, mentioned in the MPP, underscore that responsibility.
Interesting point, too, about 112F actually limiting the PTO's interpretation. You mentioned Inri Donaldson.
Yes, that's an important nuance. Normally, during examination, a PTO gives claims their broadest reasonable interpretation, or BRI, but when a limitation is determined to fall under 112F, the BRI for that specific limitation is constrained. It can't be broader than the corresponding structure disclosed in the specification and its equivalents.
So 112F acts as a built-in constraint on the BRI for that element.
Correct.
Okay, let's pivot to the potential danger zone. What if a claim limitation is found to be under 112, but then the examiner looks at the specification and there's nothing there, or not enough?
That's where things can really go south for the applicant. If 112F applies, the specification must adequately disclose the corresponding structure, material, or acts that perform the claimed function.
And if it doesn't?
If it doesn't provide that adequate disclosure, the claim limitation, and potentially the whole claim, can be rejected as indefinite under 35 U.S.C. 112b.
Indefinite, meaning it fails to particularly point out and distinctly claim the invention. Because the key part, the structure linked by 112F, isn't clearly defined anywhere.
Precisely. The claim relies on the spec for meaning, and if the spec is silent or fatally vague, the claim itself becomes unclear.
The sources gave an example, right? Something about known methods.
Yeah, simply saying the function can be done using known methods or conventional techniques usually isn't enough. If 112F applies, you generally need to point to specific structures or acts in the specification. You can't just sort of punt to the general knowledge of the field in that situation.
And the Biomedino case reinforces that.
Right. Biomedino, LLC v. Waters Tech, is often cited for the principle that you need that specific disclosure link when 112F is in play.
Okay, stepping back for the bigger picture then.
Yeah.
Why is truly understanding Section 2181 so critical beyond just navigating examination?
Because this interpretation under 2181 sets the legal boundaries of the claim. That scope definition matters immensely, not just when you're arguing with the examiner, but potentially years later in court, if the patent is ever litigated, either being enforced or challenged.
So getting this wrong has long-term consequences. If you inadvertently trigger 112F with vague functional language, and maybe your spec only shows one way to do it,
then your claim might be interpreted much more narrowly than you thought, potentially limited just to that one example structure and its equivalents.
or worse, if the spec support isn't even there.
The claim could be invalidated entirely for indefiniteness. It's a serious risk.
So wrapping this part up, what's the main takeaway? It seems like Section 2181 is a powerful reminder about the interplay between claims and the specification.
Absolutely. It tells practitioners and inventors, be incredibly careful with functional claiming. If you're going to rely on function, Make absolutely sure it's anchored by sufficient corresponding structure, either right there in the claim or clearly disclosed in the specification if you intend to invoke or might inadvertently invoke 112F.
It really underscores that drafting strong, clear, defensible patents requires understanding these nuances. It's not just about getting a patent, but getting one with the right scope and validity.
Precisely. Clarity and specificity are paramount, especially when linking function to structure.
Before we conclude, special thanks go to Mike Shepard, the creative director who brought this project to life. Disclaimer. This summary of the MPEP was generated using AI tools, including ChatGPT and NotebookLM, and may contain errors or omissions. It is provided for general educational and informational purposes only and is not legal advice or a substitute for formal instruction. For authoritative guidance, consult the official MPEP, a qualified instructor, or a registered patent practitioner.
And maybe a final thought to leave you with. Just think about how a seemingly small choice in claim drafting, using a phrase like means for doing something versus describing the structure, can fundamentally alter the legal power and reach of your patent.
Yeah, it shows that the words you choose aren't just descriptive, they're actively defining the legal territory of the invention itself. Precision isn't just nice to have, it's essential.